Okay, we might make a start. Thank you very much for your interest in this webinar, the second that I've done for ASIAL, and I'd like to just say at the outset a thank you to ASIAL for organising this. I certainly found the first webinar a good experience. I hope you did likewise, and the fact that it's recorded by ASIAL and then posted on YouTube is a good opportunity for others to revisit parts of it if they wish. So this one, as I say, will be available for later viewing, and there will be another webinar done by the SLED on the 12th of November. You'll get a break from me, luckily for you, and Brian Moyer will be conducting that one. That'll be looking at the SLED's enforcement activities and powers. But today we're going to be talking about providing persons and focusing on the impact of subcontracting on some of the compliance obligations for master licensees. I invite you to use your chat screens to put any questions as I'm going along. It may be, if you ask a question that I know I'm going to cover later on, I'll leave it, and I may come back to some questions later on, but ask them as they occur to you, and I'll scroll through them later on. So let's get straight into it. So I'm going to give you an overview of the providing persons definition and change. We'll talk about why the government made that change, and then we'll look at some of the specific compliance obligations around that. So in my mind, perhaps the most significant of the changes that were made to the security industry legislation in November 2012 was this change in master license authority from employing persons to providing persons. So previously, master licenses authorised the licence holder to employ a certain number of persons to carry on security activities, and as you would know if you've been in the industry for some time, persons engaged via subcontracting were not included within the authority of the master licence, and the licensee was not responsible for any compliance obligations relating to subcontracted persons. So for example, if a subcontractor supplied an unlicensed guard, it wasn't the principal service provider's problem. Now, master licensees must hold a licence that authorises the total number of persons that they provide on a daily basis. So that's an important thing. So on a daily basis to customers to carry on security activities. So if you have quite a number of people on your books, but at any one time you only provide, so let's say you've got 20 people on your books, but your contracts only require you to provide on any day 10 people, you only need a 4 to 14 master license rather than that number for your total number of potential employees. That's particularly important for small businesses who in the past raised concerns that, say they're a small locksmithing firm with only a couple of people and someone's going on a holiday and they need to replace that person for a period of time. Previously that potentially added to the number of employees and might have affected the master license class that they needed to hold. But now it's calculated only on a daily basis. So as long as you don't exceed the number of people you authorised each day, you're fine. But with that change, master licensees who provide security operatives via subcontracting share responsibility with the direct employer of those operatives for all the associated compliance obligations. So why did the government make this change? Well, the intent of that and others that we'll discuss today was quite frankly to discourage subcontracting. We understand, the government understood, and we SLED understand there are many instances where subcontracting is the only way for security services to be provided. And you've got circumstances where there are contracts that might be a national contract and the principal service provider will be reliant on subcontractors in, say, regional centres. But you've also got situations where a master licensee will be caught short with numbers and we'll have to rely on a subcontractor supplying some supplementary guards to get them through a contract at a venue. So it's to discourage but not eliminate subcontracting. It's to ensure that subcontracting can't be used to avoid licensing and other compliance requirements. So there was real concern that with the change to the legislation, particularly the change to the fees, which we all know increased quite significantly, we didn't want a situation where the primary contractors, who potentially were reaping the greatest rewards from contracts, could potentially be paying a lesser licensing fee than the people actually supplying the security operatives. So that's one of the reasons why we changed to providing from employing. And the government also wanted to ensure that when subcontracting was used, that it would be transparent, particularly to the client. We didn't want instances, as had happened in the past, where clients felt that they were perhaps paying a premium amount for what they saw as a brand name service, little knowing that they were getting some small firm, perhaps wearing the big players' uniforms. So it's important that clients know exactly what they're paying for, really. So just to clarify that intent, so the then Minister for Police, Michael Gallagher, at the time said that subcontracting is a significant problem within the security industry. Currently, a business that secures contracts to provide security services and entirely subcontracts that work out is not required to hold a master license, as the business is not employing any person to carry on security activities. This means that directors, shareholders and managers of the business are not subject to probity checks. So a good way to think about that has been raised many times is the type of facility management businesses that perhaps for a venue they might bid for the contract to provide cleaning, security and general business management. It's one of the things that in the past, they've got a good control in that situation as to who will actually provide the security services, but they weren't subject to any of the probity checks. They weren't required to be licensed, but that has all changed. So the Minister also said that in addition, the subcontractor needs to deliver the security services with a lesser profit margin than would be the case if it was contracted directly to the client. And this in turn leads to problems endemic in the industry of non-compliance, low wages and labour exploitation. Now again, that's focusing on what we term unnecessary subcontracting, where the client, perhaps given the choice and given the transparency, would prefer to deal directly with the end supplier of the guards. But there's many instances. So, like, if a client, for example, is looking to engage a security consultant to give them an entire package solution, in many instances the client will have absolutely no interest in having to deal with individual alarm installers or CCTV installers. They want to just deal with someone who will package the whole solution for them, and that's fine, but it's important that the client knows that elements of that service are being provided by other master licensees. So that's where we'll talk a little later about the disclosure requirements. But when that is happening, when a client is choosing to deal with a principal service provider, under these new rules, that principal service provider can't distance themselves from the compliance requirements that are associated with delivering that service. So with the providing persons change, that principal is responsible for all compliance aspects now. And I understand someone is viewing this webinar from actually on a plane mid-flight, so there you go, it's a truly international affair. So focusing on who actually needs to hold a master license. Okay, so I've tried to word this in simple terms. We'll look at each one and examples. So a master license must be held by anyone who is paid to deliver a security service that involves the carrying on of security activities as defined by the legislation, and then pays someone else to provide that service on their behalf, whether that's an individual or a company. So going back to that situation of, say, a facilities management company, if they're being paid, they've won a contract that includes the provision of a security service, they're being paid to provide that security service. So if they're paying another company to actually deliver that part of the contract, they need to hold a master license. Now, a few times I might stop, as I'm doing at the moment, just to read a particularly lengthy question and see if there's anything I need to cover. Okay, someone's asked me a question in relation to what I mentioned. I'll go back to the slide that the question relates to. So the question is about this, the total number of persons they provide on a daily basis. And yes, to clarify, it is on a daily basis. That's a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight. So someone's indicated, that it's a very different rationale to at any one time, deliberately so. It would be, quite frankly, a compliance and enforcement nightmare if we had to identify how many people were on duty at any one time. Particularly large firms with multiple contracts, multiple venues, or locksmithing firms with locksmiths all over the place, to identify who might be on breaks, who has not yet commenced a shift, who's finished a shift, who might have left early, is a nightmare. And this ties in with the introduction of the sign-on registers, which I covered in my previous webinar. Those sign-on registers are an important part for master licensees to ensure compliance with this daily basis, but it's also used by our compliance and enforcement officers to check that there is compliance. Actually, we'll just go back to another example about this. So again, I want to make sure that this webinar, unlike the previous one, is relevant to all sectors of the industry, because it does apply across the board. So another example here where the providing persons and subcontracting affects master license requirements. Here, imagine a small locksmithing firm, maybe even a self-employed locksmith who services a regional area, wants to look after, understandably, the clients that have some loyalty to them at the moment, but they're assisting one client at a time, and another customer gives them a call and says, I urgently need some assistance with locksmithing issue. Now, the master licensee has, I guess, a couple of options. They can say, I'm not able to assist you at this time, but I know that Fred Smith, who runs another local locksmithing service, is pretty reliable, and here's his contact details, and he might be able to help you out. If he does that, there's absolutely no impact on his master license. If, however, he says to the customer, no problem, I'm on another job, but I'll get one of my guys to come over and help you, and then he rings Fred Smith's locksmith and says, Fred, can you help me out on this? I need this job done. I'll fix you up once the client's paid me. He's subcontracted that service. He needs a master license that authorises not only his own activities but also Fred's activities. So if he's a self-employed individual, he can't do that unless he's got a master license that covers 1 to 3 persons, and he's going to have some disclosure requirements for that customer. So it really does apply across the board. We're not just talking about manpower firms, and we're not just talking about large manpower firms with significant contracts. So you also need a master license if you are paid to deliver a security service by someone other than your employer and you provide that service yourself, that is, as a self-employed individual. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, I've just had someone say that they only have audio but no voice. Perhaps if we could get some clarification. Can everyone see and hear this presentation okay? Please let me know if there is a problem, and we'll pause and get that fixed up. Okay, okay, great. Okay, everyone else saying no problem, so hopefully it's at that person's end. Okay, thank you, everyone. Okay, so you also need a master license if you employ security licensees. Person's saying that they're happy with audio. I can't blame you. I know what I look like too, and you probably got a better deal only getting audio. Although you are missing out on the slides, unfortunately. So you need a master license if you employ security licensees to meet your own in-house security needs. And that's something different to some of the other jurisdictions that don't license in-house security. Okay, so a person, and this is section 7 of the legislation that I paraphrased, and it's always important that you actually go to the legislation itself, not rely on my paraphrasing, because I'm trying to put things in plain English, but it's important that you understand the actual provisions of the legislation. But section 7 of the legislation essentially says that a person must not provide persons to carry on security activities unless they hold a master license, and they provide no more persons on any one day than the number of persons authorised by the master license, unless they're covered by a TEPS permit for that day. Now, some of you may not have heard of a TEPS permit. They're not being used as much as we thought they might be. TEPS permit stands for Temporary Excess Provision of Services Permit, which is why we say TEPS. It is a way that you, for one day at a time, can get authority to exceed your master license. So it's most used by, one of the examples I see a bit is a regional security firm that might win the contract to provide security services at, say, a festival that's being held in that area. So on one particular day, they need to significantly increase the usual number of people that they provide. So in those circumstances, rather than pay for an upgrade to their master license, which could be quite a significant expense if they need to go up to the over 50 employees, they can apply for a TEPS permit for that day. And the cost of a TEPS permit is $150 per day. So it can work out to be a significantly cheaper option. And it is open-ended then. It's not, it doesn't cover you for a particular number of people. It just means you have an open-ended authority to exceed your allowable number of people for that day. We do have a form on our website that you can download and submit, but you can also apply for these TEPS permits online. Okay, one of the people who has asked a question here about back-to-base monitoring, and I will cover that because it is particularly an area that's particularly affected by providing persons, and those of you who are paying close attention to matters that are discussed by the SLED Advisory Council will know that this particular issue was discussed at an early meeting of the Council. Those who don't follow it, I encourage you to keep track of matters we discuss at the Council. On our website, the SLED website, you have access to all the communiques and agenda papers that are associated with the Council, so you can see the issues that are being discussed and follow the resolutions. But on that issue, okay, my agenda paper that I did for the Council focused on what I think this question is asking, and that's where you've got an alarm monitoring company, an alarm installation company who wants to sell a package solution to their customers that includes the back-to-base monitoring. So before the providing persons issue, that really had no impact on their master license. Now it has a significant impact, because in a back-to-base monitoring situation, there is typically 3 players. You've got the master licensee who installs the camera, an alarm system, and/or alarm system. You have the monitoring service, and then you have, most instances, the alarm response service, which is the actual guards that go out and check when there's been an alarm trigger. So now, if the alarm installation company is charging or is being paid by the customer to provide that full service, then they are responsible for every element of that. They are responsible for the subcontractors at the monitoring centre and the alarm response company. They're responsible for all the compliance responsibilities associated with that. It becomes very difficult for the alarm monitoring company, for the alarm installation company, to keep track of all those responsibilities. So we do not encourage it, but the legislation supports it. My agenda paper to the council, in acknowledging that this had a major impact on that sector, kind of proposed, do we need to re-examine the legislation, or is this just one of those things where the sector needs to change its practices, or just simply come to terms with these new requirements? The council resolved that this type of scenario is exactly what the legislation is trying to discourage, but again, not eliminate, and that there should be no change to the legislation. So one of the options, basically there are a few options for the alarm installation company. They can simply indicate to the customer, look, I'll give you the alarm service, I've got an agreement with a monitoring service, I can't charge you for that, they'll take over the business, they'll charge you directly, then the alarm installation company is out of the picture, there's no subcontracting happening. And if they want to operate under some sort of commission arrangement with the monitoring service for a customer referral, that's fine, that's not captured by the legislation. But if they charge that customer for the ongoing service, they've got to take responsibility for it. I could take a lot of time discussing all of this, but I think I would spend too much time on one particular interest point. So again, I encourage you to have a look at that agenda paper for the SLED Advisory Council. I think it might have been the 2nd or 3rd meeting of the council, but have a look through there. That will identify for you all of the relevant issues. And as I work through this presentation, I'll touch on that where I can. So what compliance requirements are impacted by subcontracting? Well, every master licensee, every compliance requirement for master licensees relates to providing a person is impacted. So if a subcontractor commits a relevant offence, then so does the principal service provider and any master licensee in between. So, you know, we've seen instances where there is multi-tier subcontracting happening, and that is something that we're trying to certainly trying to prevent. When there is multi-tier subcontracting, the person who's actually supplying the security officers is really being squeezed in terms of their margins, and that's where we start to see subcontracting having direct impact on compliance with the legislation and also compliance with industrial and taxation requirements, which I think we all want to see stopped. You know, before this change was brought in, I remember getting a complaint where a particular venue was unhappy with their security provider, so they went out to contract. They selected a new security provider at a higher rate than they were previously paying, and then it turned out that the security provider that won the contract offered it back to the original service provider through a subcontractor arrangement. So really the client or the customer was getting screwed there. These arrangements prevent that now through the disclosure requirements that I'll talk about a little later on. So today I'm going to just focus on the requirements relating to providing only licensed persons to carry on security activities, the prohibitions on unauthorised subcontracting. I seem to be a bit tongue-tied today, apologies, and keeping records of contracts. So if you saw my previous webinar, which was on incident registers and sign-on registers, I did speak about the impacts on those requirements of subcontracting. So I'm not going to talk about it again today, but that webinar, if you missed it, is available on YouTube. So I encourage you to have a look at that. So focusing on providing unlicensed persons first. So a master licensee, it's a standard requirement, and this is section 39 of our legislation from memory. I should know these things off by heart, but I don't yet. I think it's 39. A master licensee must not provide any person to carry on a security activity if that person does not hold the required Class 1 or Class 2 license. So the key word in that sentence is must not provide. It used to say must not employ any person. So this now affects every element or every tier of a subcontracting chain. So if you are a principal contract holder and you subcontract a service out and your subcontractor supplies an unlicensed individual to work on that contract, you have committed an offence. Now, it is a defence, and the legislation says it is a defence, if the master licensee satisfies the court that they did not know and could not reasonably have been expected to know that the person did not hold the required licence. And again, I'm paraphrasing here, so always refer back to the legislation, and I've underlined what I think is the important bit there, could not reasonably have been expected to know. So you can't simply say as a principal contractor, well, I don't know who the subcontractor supplies, so I didn't know the person was unlicensed. You have a responsibility now to make sure you know who is servicing all the contracts that you hold. And I'm aware of some large security firms that are very conscious of compliance, for which I'm very grateful, and I know some of them have a number of staff listening to this webinar. They've got really good processes in place. They demand that all their subcontractors supply to them the details of all the people that they use on those contracts, and they run them through automated public register checks to make sure that they are licensed. And if they come up with a red flag that the person isn't licensed, they immediately go to the subcontractor and deny permission for that person to work on that contract, or tell them that they need to stand down that person immediately. Now, I'm not going to, and nor could I, tell anyone what they need to do to satisfy the court that they've taken reasonable steps to guard against committing an offence in this regard. But I would suggest that the security firms that have those sort of practices in place and can show that they do it and have it well documented, would be in a good position to argue that they could not reasonably have been expected to know that the subcontractor put an unlicensed person on. For example, if the subcontractor deceived them or didn't disclose to them when they are required to a particular person's details. I would say though that if a principal contractor is going to argue that they could not reasonably have been expected to know, then that is going to create far greater ramifications usually for the subcontractor, because it will usually follow that the subcontractor has deceived the principal. But anyway, it's really important if you are subcontracting, if you're using subcontractors, that you really take, you've got everything in place to make sure that you're covered, and those subcontractors aren't going to expose you to offence provisions. Okay, moving on, and as I say, as I'm going along, if you've got any questions, type them in, and I'll either answer them as I go through or come back to them at the end. I want to focus now on the consent and disclosure requirements. So to promote transparency in the subcontracting arrangement, the legislation now prohibits the use of subcontractors unless the client has expressly consented in writing, for example, in the contract for services, to the work being subcontracted. And I'll come back to that. But the legislation also requires that the principal service security provider must notify the client before requiring payment of the name and license number of any subcontractors used by the principal. So firstly, let's focus on the requirement for the client to consent. So the large security firms will no doubt always have written okay, I'm getting some advice is that audio is very interrupted, although it's okay via the dial-in. Yep, so if you are having problems dial in, hopefully you know what that means. But Erica has put those details on the screen. So there you go, I'm only focusing on your questions. But focusing again back to the consent requirements. So as I was saying, many large security firms will always have written contracts with their clients. So just include part of a provision in that contract to say something along the lines that the client understands and consents to the use of subcontractors. It may be that the client wants to put some conditions associated with that, and that's fine. It can be that the client might only consent in instances where you give them notice that it has occurred, or they'll consent, but you're not able to use, say, a particular security firm that they might have dealt with in the past. All I'm saying is it does not have to be simply blanket consent. The client has the ability to place conditions on that, and when we audit the compliance, we'll want to see that you've complied with any conditions that the client has asked for, because that is part of their consent. If you breach the terms of their consent, then you've engaged in prohibited subcontracting. Now, what I want to mention though is the smaller firms who maybe don't have written contracts. So I spoke about that little situation where the local locksmith is not able to immediately attend to a customer's needs and wants to ask Fred Smith to step in on their behalf to help out a customer. Now, it's probably uncommon that locksmith and impractical for the locksmith to get a written contract in place with the customer beforehand. But as I said, it's important and it's required by the legislation that the client have some transparency about that subcontracting. So in those instances, the locksmith has to get the express consents in writing of the client. Now, in writing does include electronic means. So what I would suggest there is the locksmith says to the customer over the telephone, look, yeah, I can look after you, but I'm going to have to use a subcontractor for that, and I need you to consent to that before I arrange it. So I'm going to fire you off a quick email, and can you just reply to say that you consent to me using a subcontractor? You've got to take those steps. I know it might, it's a major change to the way you do your business potentially, but you have to do it. The client has, based on the legislation, the right to know and to give approval to you using a contractor. And it's the same going back to that alarm installation company that's selling also back-to-base monitoring. You have to tell the customer that you're not actually providing that service and using subcontractors, and you need to get their consent in writing. And I'll talk in a moment about the records that you need to maintain when, if a compliance and audit or if an enforcement officer from SLED comes out to do a compliance audit of you, we're going to ask to see these documents. You must have them. Now, the next bit about the requirement that you notify the client of the name and license number of the subcontractors you actually use. Note there that it says before requiring payment. I would suggest that the best way to do this, and the way that I think most companies are complying, is that they're including these details either in the invoice that they send the customer or in a letter that accompanies the invoice. Whenever you issue a customer with an invoice, you've always got terms of payment. It might be 14 days, 21 days, whatever. But you are not requiring payment at the time you actually issue the invoice, generally. You are requiring payment at some later time. So you do meet the requirements of this aspect of the legislation if you include the details with the invoice. As I said, that seems to be the way most people are doing it, and it makes perfect sense. The other way that you can do it is if you know what subcontractor you're going to use to service a particular contract, you can include it in the actual contract. So at the time you're getting the client's express consent in writing to the work being subcontracted, if you declare in that, that I as the customer consent to this work being subcontracted to Fred Smith's Locksmiths, master license, blah, 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 you've met the terms of the requirement. Of course, if you need to change that subcontractor during the life of the contract, you're going to have to go back and get the contract changed and re-signed if you choose to do it that way. But that is another method. So again, ask me any questions associated with that, but hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. Now, it's important to note that these requirements apply at all levels of subcontracting arrangements. So if we are seeing a multi-tier subcontracting arrangement, it applies at all the different layers. So for example, if a subcontractor engaged by a principal wants to further subcontract the work, they can't do that without the principal's written consent. And if such consent is given, they must notify the principal of the further subcontracting's particulars before requiring payment. But it only works at one level. So if you've got a client and a principal, and if I had more time, you'd have some lovely diagrams to look at here, but you're not here to look at a slideshow, you're here to listen to a talk. So we've got the client, we've got the principal, we've got a subcontractor, and we've got a further subcontractor. The client only needs to consent to the principal subcontracting the work and only needs to be told who the principal subcontractors are. If the subcontractor further subcontracts the work, there's no requirement to notify up to the client who those further subcontractors are. Yes, in an ideal situation, there would be that level of disclosure, but it just wouldn't be practical. Given that the details have to be passed on before payment could be made, you'd have the principal would be delayed in being able to seek payment from the clients until they got the lower level details passed on to them. So that's why the consent and disclosure requirements only apply one layer up and one layer down. Hopefully that makes sense to you. But again, if it doesn't, please ask me a question about that. So about the records that need to be kept. So master licensees must keep the following records for at least 3 years. Now, you won't find this in the legislation. This is something that, as I mentioned in my previous webinar, part of this talk, just as with my previous webinar, was to give industry an opportunity to comment on some requirements that we're planning to formalise. These are draft requirements, this part now. Everything that I've spoken about to date is enshrined in the legislation that's fixed. And many of you will know SLED's responsibility is to administer the legislation. The legislation is actually developed by another agency and reflects the government's intent. So if you're unhappy with the legislation, SLED is simply administering that legislation. But this next aspect, just as with sign-on and incident registers, is where the legislation allows the Commission to determine what records need to be kept and the manner and form in which those records need to be kept. So I welcome any feedback that you might want to provide about that. So let me just scroll back down to the bottom so I don't miss a question. All right, so as I was saying, master licensees must keep the following records for at least 3 years. Details of any contract or agreement to provide security services entered into between the master licensee and a client or another master licensee, who would be the principal, involving the provision by the subject master licensee of Class 1 and Class 2 licensees to provide security services on behalf of the principal. So in simple terms, this is where you are the subcontractor. You need to keep details of the contracts that you hold with the principal service provider. And if you are a principal and you're subcontracting work, or if you're a subcontractor and you're further subcontracting work, you need to keep details of the contracts and agreements you hold with your subcontractors. Now, to talk about what the actual details behind those contracts are that need to be kept. And someone's asked a question which I will come back to for that. Thank you. So in terms of those contracts, so master licensees must keep the following details in relation to each contract or agreement. And hopefully, there's nothing that should be particularly onerous about this. This should be just standard business practices in any event, even if we didn't impose it. You've got to keep the name and address of the client, principal and or subcontractor as applicable. And if we're talking about a subcontracting arrangement, you need to keep the master license number of the principal and or the subcontractor, if and as applicable. You need to maintain the address and or premises or venue name at which the security services were, are or will be provided. So obviously a contract is usually entered into before the event, so that's a situation where they will be provided. During the life of the contract, those details need to be maintained, so that's where they are being provided. And even though the contract has ceased for a period of 3 years, you need to keep the details where you did provide security services. You need to keep the contract, the date upon which the contract or agreement was entered into, and again, all of this should form a standard part of a contract. But those instances where I spoke about with the locksmith who asked the customer to email them their consent, these are the type of details that they need to keep in their records associated with that little agreement that they've entered into. So the date upon which the contract or agreement commenced or commences, the date upon which the contract or agreement ceased or will cease, the security services that were, are or will be provided under the contract or agreement, so just the contract particulars, the agreed price for the provision of the security services, e.g. the total value or the daily hourly rate. Now I know that some of you will object to that particular provision and think, well, why should I need to include that? Now again, surely it is part of your normal contract that it will be there. I know when SLED was formed, there was some concerns about client confidentiality and those sort of issues. All I can do is assure you that everyone who works for SLED is subject to very stringent integrity requirements, and we absolutely protect your confidentiality. We are obtaining these records for auditing purposes and for no other purpose. But as we've never made any secret, we are, we make sure that if we identify in the course of an audit that we conduct looking at security compliance, if we identify during that audit a reasonable suspicion that there is breaches of industrial requirements or taxation requirements, we do share information with those other agencies. So there will be instances where we're looking through compliance with our legislation and we think, hang on, that the hourly rate being charged for that contract is ridiculously low. we're going to make a disclosure to the relevant agencies about that. If they choose to do nothing, that's their call, but we will make that information available to them, because I think it's important that all agencies work together to try and clear up these sort of issues in the industry. And I know ASIAL, with the work they've been doing with the Fair Work Ombudsman, shares that view. And just to kind of sidestep a little, but many of you would be aware of ASIAL's programs trying to get people to understand that from an industrial sense and the responsibility to comply with water requirements, clients and principal contractors have that responsibility and have that exposure if subcontractors and service providers are not paying their people appropriately. So including these details in the records you keep gives you an opportunity to think, hang on, I might be exposed here. My subcontractor is potentially not paying their people properly, and I need to look into that. And again, people are asking questions, so I'll come back to those. So we need the name of the persons who entered into the contract or agreement on behalf of each party. So that would normally be the signatories to the contract. And if it's relevant, that is, if there is actually subcontracting happening, you need to keep the express agreement of the master licensee or client or principal to the provision of through subcontracting. So don't forget that in all of what I've just spoken about, these are not just details that are relevant where there is subcontracting. These are details that need to be kept if there is just simply an arrangement between a master licensee and a client with no other subcontracting. We need the details of these contracts to be kept. Now, before I come back to the questions, my last slide is just to say that these records must be legible and made in the English language. They must be kept in a manner that ensures that they are readily accessible and able to be produced to, examined by and copied by or for enforcement officers as necessary throughout the 3-year retention period. Now, this is the same requirement as I spoke about with sign-on and incident registers. A little different there when I spoke about the ability for records then to be kept electronically. Given that they are records that are being kept in real time and updated regularly, there was a need to talk about things like password protections and those sort of issues and unauthorised changes. Here, generally, yes, the records can be kept electronically, but I would expect that when they are, they're generally going to take the form of a scanned document. So you'll have a written contract with a client, or as we spoke about, it could be an email between you and the client, which will then be either scanned or archived, and that can be reproduced to us. But if you are storing electronically, just as if you're keeping hard copy records, you need to make sure that you can produce them. So it's no use saying, if a SLED comes along and says, show us your contracts, and you say, oh, terribly bad luck, I've had a server problem, I can't produce those to you. Well, you haven't complied with your requirements there. You might have a reasonable defence, but you're certainly going to have to put that defence forward because we will assume non-compliance. All right, I'm going to run back through questions. This is your opportunity as I'm doing so to ask any more questions. We're getting close to the hour mark, so let's make sure that we've covered everything. So someone's asked here, someone said about one-off ad hoc provision of services in the case of, say, an emergency request. Well, that's where I spoke about the requirement to, could be an email exchange between the customer and you to say that they consent. But look, you need to really, if you think, in so many instances, there will be emergency situations where you might not have any intent to to use subcontractors to service a client, but there's always a chance that you'll be caught short and you do need to call on some emergency supplementary resources. Get it in the contract, educate the client, be upfront with the client, say that, look, I don't intend to subcontract it, but this is what could happen, and get that reflected in the contract. That might be where, as I said, the conditions of consent come in. That the client might only consent in the case of an emergency, but we'll expect that in almost all instances you will use your own directly employed people to service the contract. But the important thing is there, no matter the emergency, you need to have client consent before you use subcontractors, and you have to disclose it after the event. So you need to think about what you need to do to make sure you're covered in that situation. Okay, other questions here. Okay, someone's asked, if a subcontractor fails to notify the principal contractor that they are supplying staff that are from another tier of subcontractor, who is liable for any compliance failures? The principal or the subcontractor that's failed to supply the information? Alright, so I might go back to the slide where that is particularly relevant, which is, I can best talk about this with the providing unlicensed persons. So this is a distinct part of the legislation to those consent and disclosure requirements. So with consent and disclosure, I spoke about how the requirements only apply one tier up and one tier down. Requirements like this, the requirement not to provide an unlicensed person, is not capped in that way. So if there is multiple tiers of subcontracting, then everyone above the actual provider of the guards is exposed if an unlicensed person works on that contract. Now, I spoke about the potential defences that a master licensee has, and I spoke about that in a situation where a master licensee has done all that they could reasonably be expected to do to ensure that compliance is met in this requirement. If they're deceived by a subcontractor, it is, it's possible. It's about as far as I go. It is possible that the court will find that they cannot be held responsible for that offence, and that it is a reasonable defence. It's up to you to get your own legal advice on those issues. But if I was a master licensee, I would be making sure I had all the steps in place that I reasonably could to know who is going to service the contracts that I hold, and that I can do the checks to make sure that they are licensed. But yeah, there'll be situations where you are deceived, and that's when you know to terminate an agreement you've got with a subcontractor and avoid them in the future. Now, that's probably a simplistic way of looking at it, but there's really no other way to describe that. Okay, just looking at the next question. Okay, does the 3-year contract record keeping also apply to OSIs? The requirements have traditionally been a 5-year period. Now, when I did speak about the fact that if we find non-compliance with another agency's requirements, we won't investigate that. We don't have any powers to investigate that, but we may stumble upon it. We may have reasonable suspicions, and when we do, we'll pass that on. It's important to say that SLED's requirements for record keeping are completely independent from OSRs or tax or Fair Work Ombudsman. If we say you've got to keep a record for 3 years and they say you've got to keep a record for 5 years, keep it for 5 years. And there may be some overlap. You keep it for the maximum period you are required by regulatory agencies to do so. Okay, in the case where you are servicing a group or collective, do you need individual agreements with each venue or site? You need individual agreements with the, you need a contract for services with the customer. If you are entering into a contract at a time where you know that contract encompasses a whole number of venues, then obviously they will be reflected in that single contract, and you'll have the details encompassed in there. Normal business practice. If a customer, an existing customer, seeks to add an additional venue, then I would imagine your normal practices are that either there will be an addendum to the original contract in which you'll disclose these additional details, or you'll enter into a new contract for that particular venue. So you know, hopefully SLED is not asking you to do anything that would be outside of your normal business practices. Really, it's only in those perhaps really small businesses that aren't used to documenting things, maybe small locksmith firms, small alarm installation firms, maybe even small guarding firms, where they're used to maybe just a gentleman's agreement, handshake, those sort of things. You're going to have to start keeping proper records. I've answered that question. Okay, I think that I've covered everyone's question. If not, please quickly do a, no, you've ignored mine. Oh, somebody has said that asking if the defence could encourage willful blindness as opposed to deception. Again, that's a matter for lawyers, but in situations where the SLED believes it's a case of willful blindness, we're going to be arguing that it's not a situation that the master licensee could not reasonably have been expected to know. You know, we'll take on any master licensee that is not taking genuine steps to ensure compliance by their subcontractors, and let's see what the court decides. Okay, thank you all. I hope you found it useful. Apologise, I was a little tongue-tied during this one for some reason, but hopefully I've still made sense. Next time, as I say, on the 12th of November, you'll have the benefit of Brian Moyer, who will be far better, and we'll cover off all of the enforcement activities that we do and the powers that we have. So that'll just give you an update, I guess, give you a sense of what to expect if SLED does come to audit you, and also give you a sense that we are out there and we are doing some good work, I believe, and making a difference. So I hope that you'll attend that one also and revisit this potentially on YouTube. Thank you very much. Bye.